He had lived in the neighborhood for years and had grown used to the quiet rhythm of his street. The rows of houses had familiar faces, the same lawns being mowed on weekends, the same chatter in the evenings. Life was simple, predictable, and comfortable. He liked it that way. Then one day something appeared where it shouldn't have been. He first noticed it when he was walking his dog early in the morning. Across the way, near the edge of his property, there were strange noises, metal clanking and the low hum of machinery. Curious, he walked closer and saw men setting up construction materials. He frowned. This was unusual. He hadn't heard anything about construction here. The HOA usually sent notices, letters, and sometimes even held meetings before any new projects started. Yet here they were, building something new. Seemingly without warning, he stood quietly, watching as the construction moved forward. Piles of lumber and metal poles were arranged and workers moved quickly, measuring, hammering, and cementing. The structure was starting to take shape. He could tell it wasn't small. Whatever it was, it would change the area. He felt a wave of unease. Something about this didn't sit right. He tried to think logically. Maybe he had just missed the announcement. Maybe there had been a meeting and he hadn't noticed. But something in his gut told him this wasn't normal. He decided to ask the HOA the next day. The next morning, he called the HOA office. The voice on the other end was polite but evasive. When he asked about the construction, the representative claimed that everything was approved and that he should not worry. The voice sounded rehearsed, like someone was hiding something. That only made him more suspicious. He decided he needed to see the permits himself. He went online to the county building department and searched for the latest permits in his area. His eyes scanned through the list. Permit after permit appeared for nearby projects, but nothing for this one. Not a single record. That confirmed his fear. The HOA had started a construction project without official approval. They were breaking rules, maybe even laws, and had done it quietly, expecting no one to notice. He didn't react angrily at first. He knew from experience that confronting people in anger rarely solved anything. Instead, he spent the next few days observing the site. He would go on short walks under the pretense of walking his dog and watch how the workers moved, what materials they used, and how the structure was positioned. Each day it seemed more imposing. It was close enough to the edge of his property that he started to worry about the land itself. The soil near his backyard was beginning to shift slightly, and water from a nearby drainage ditch was starting to pool differently. Even the smallest changes in terrain could cause flooding or erosion if ignored. He knew that, legally, the HOA had a responsibility to maintain proper boundaries and protect neighboring properties. Clearly, they were not thinking about that. As he watched, he also noticed the reactions of the neighbors. Most were walking past without paying attention. Some even smiled and waved at the workers, thinking everything was fine. A few looked concerned, but said nothing. It seemed like everyone trusted the HOA, or maybe they were just too afraid to question them. He understood that fear. HOS had power. They controlled the community, the rules, and sometimes the finances. Many people avoided conflict because they didn't want headaches or retaliation, but he couldn't ignore it. Something needed to be done before this structure caused damage or legal problems. He started taking notes. Every day, he documented what he saw, the size of the construction, the workers' hours, and any changes in the landscape. He even took photos discreetly, trying not to draw attention to himself. He wanted evidence, something concrete that could be used if the situation escalated. The more he watched, the more he realized that this wasn't just a minor oversight. The HOA had deliberately avoided the proper channels. They had assumed that no one would notice, or that people would be too scared to complain. It was bold and reckless. He could feel his frustration building, but he reminded himself to stay calm. Logic would win over emotion. After a week of observing, he decided to speak to one neighbor he trusted. The neighbor was older and had lived there longer than anyone. He had seen similar incidents before, though not as serious. The older neighbor listened carefully as he explained what he had discovered about the unapproved construction. The man shook his head slowly. "This is bad," he said. "You can't just let them do this. But you have to be careful. UHS don't like being challenged. He nodded, understanding the warning. They had power, yes, but they didn't have the law on their side if permits were missing. That was where he needed to focus. He spent the next few days gathering information from the county office. He learned about building codes, water drainage requirements, property boundaries, and HOA responsibilities. Every detail mattered. Every small regulation could be a key to protecting his property. He read about how improper construction could affect soil stability, flooding, and even local wildlife. He realized that this wasn't just about the HOA ignoring the rules. It could have serious consequences if left unchecked. He felt a mix of worry and determination. He needed to act, but he also needed a plan. Meanwhile, the HOA construction continued. The structure grew taller, its walls forming a solid presence near the edge of his property. He could see cracks beginning to form in the nearby soil. Water from recent rains pooled strangely, and he worried that if the construction continued without proper engineering, it could cause real damage. He thought about what would happen if the heavy rains came next week. The structure might collapse, or water might overflow, damaging both the HOA property and his own. The stakes were real, and waiting any longer was dangerous. He also began noticing the reactions of the workers. Some of them looked uneasy, checking their phones or glancing around nervously. Perhaps they had heard whispers about permits, or maybe they simply knew the neighbors were watching. Either way, it was clear that even among those building the structure, there was a sense that this wasn't entirely right. He took note of that. It could become useful later if authorities got involved. Witnesses who acknowledged the irregularity could help prove his case. One evening, after a particularly heavy rain, he walked past the construction again. The pooling water near the base of the structure had increased, and he realized that if nothing was done, the HOA's illegal building could cause serious flooding. He felt a surge of urgency. This wasn't a distant problem, it was immediate. That night, he stayed up planning his next steps. He couldn't stop the HOA by yelling or arguing. He needed facts, evidence, and a strategy that would protect him and his property. He listed every observation, every photo, and every document he had found. He knew that preparation was key. Over the next few days, he quietly talked to a few more neighbors, testing the waters. Many of them had noticed the construction, but assumed it was legal. Some were afraid to say anything. He listened, offered reassurance, and explained why permits and approvals mattered. Slowly, a few neighbors began to see the problem as he did. It was not about personal attacks on the HOA. It was about law, safety, and responsibility. Together, they began to realize that this could not continue unchecked, even as he planned and observed. He maintained his daily routines, never letting the tension overwhelm him completely. He walked his dog, tended to his garden, and continued his regular work. But the shadow of the construction was always in the back of his mind. It reminded him that sometimes quiet neighborhoods held unexpected battles. He thought about how power could be misused when rules were ignored, and how important it was for ordinary people to stand up calmly and intelligently. He understood that he was not just protecting his property, but also setting an example of how reason, patience, and preparation could counteract recklessness. By the end of the first month, the HOA structure was almost complete, its walls now solid and its presence undeniable. Yet, for all its size and strength, it was built on shaky ground literally and legally. He had gathered all the evidence he needed, spoken to neighbors, and prepared a plan to protect his property. The next steps would require careful timing, legal guidance, and the courage to act. For now, he stood on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in orange and gold, knowing that his quiet life was about to intersect with an unusual challenge, and he felt ready. After watching the construction for weeks, he realized he could not act without proper knowledge. He needed to understand the full extent of what the HOA was doing. Sitting at his kitchen table one morning, he spread out maps, documents, and notes he had gathered. The lines on the maps showed boundaries, water paths, and his own property layout. He compared them carefully with what he had observed from the street. Every measurement, every angle mattered. If he wanted to challenge the HOA, he had to be sure. He decided to go to the county office in person. The clerk at the building department listened politely as he explained that he wanted to check permits for a project in his neighborhood. After some searching, the clerk confirmed his suspicion. There was no permit for the structure. The absence was glaring. The clerk also gave him advice on what he could do next, including reporting the illegal construction to inspectors and taking steps to protect his land. He thanked the clerk, knowing that these steps would form the backbone of his plan. He spent the next few days poring over regulations. There were rules about construction, land use, drainage, and safety that the HOA had clearly ignored. Each page he read made him more confident that he had a strong case. At the same time, he studied the potential risks. Without proper approval, the structure could collapse, erode nearby land, or cause flooding. The realization made the situation feel urgent. It was no longer just about rules. It was about preventing possible disaster. To prepare further, he reached out to an expert in land and water management. The expert visited his property and inspected the surrounding area. Together, they walked the paths of water that flowed near the construction site. They measured the slope of the land and checked the soil. The expert pointed out how small mistakes in building placement could lead to large problems. "This HOA project is risky," the expert said. They didn't think about the consequences. If it rains heavily, it could cause real damage. This confirmed what he had feared and reinforced the importance of planning carefully. He started documenting everything more methodically. Each observation, each photo, and each conversation with neighbors became part of a growing file. He realized that the more thorough he was, the harder it would be for the HOA to dismiss his concerns. He also kept a daily log of weather conditions, noting rainfall and how water moved across the land. It seemed like small details, but they could make all the difference in showing that the construction was dangerous and illegal. As he continued his investigation, he also paid attention to the people involved. The workers seemed unaware of the lack of permits. He imagined how they had been told to complete the job quickly, without asking questions. It reminded him that not everyone was part of the problem. Some were simply doing their job. This thought helped him stay calm. His goal was not to punish individuals, but to ensure that the construction followed the law and that his property was protected. During this time, he spoke quietly with a few neighbors who shared similar concerns. Many of them were worried, but didn't know what to do. He explained the process of checking permits, gathering evidence, and contacting authorities. Some began taking their own notes, and a few even joined him on walks around the property to observe changes. Slowly, he felt a sense of quiet solidarity forming. It was a reminder that community mattered and that careful action could influence outcomes. He also started to think strategically about timing. If he reported the construction too early, it might be ignored or delayed. If he waited too long, damage could occur, and the HOA could claim it was too late to intervene. Balancing patience with action became a daily concern. He learned to watch, document, and wait for the right moment to take the next steps. Day, he felt more prepared, more confident, and more aware of the importance of his approach. Meanwhile, the construction continued at a steady pace. The structure became more imposing, and he noticed small issues developing. Water pooled in areas it had never reached before. Soil shifted slightly under the weight of the materials. Knew from his research that these were early warning signs. Without proper permits and engineering, the HOA had no plan for these risks. The structure looked solid, but beneath the surface, problems were growing. His concern increased, but so did his determination. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Planning, evidence, and calm thinking were his tools. One evening, he met with the expert again to discuss possible solutions if things went wrong. The expert suggested ways to manage water flow legally on his property and prevent damage. They even drew up rough diagrams of diversion channels and small barriers that could be installed. This gave him hope. He realized that he didn't have to fight blindly. There were lawful ways to protect his land and show the HOA's mistakes. At the same time, he began to consider the HOA's motivations. Why had they built without permits? Was it oversight? Or did they assume no one would notice? Perhaps it was impatience, a desire to impress, or an effort to save money. Understanding their perspective helped him anticipate their next moves. He could plan responses that were logical, legal, and effective. It was clear that reacting with anger would accomplish little. Careful action was the key. He also kept track of the neighbors who were indifferent or fearful. He didn't push them, but he made sure they were informed about potential risks. Even small conversations about safety and property boundaries were important. Awareness alone could prevent future problems. He felt a quiet responsibility to educate and protect, even if some neighbors preferred to stay silent. Days turned into weeks, and the structure neared completion. Despite the appearance of strength, he could see the flaws. The lack of proper drainage, poor soil stability, and the absence of permits were all clear. Each observation reinforced the need for a strong plan. He felt a growing sense of purpose. He was no longer just a concerned neighbor. He was someone who understood the rules, the risks, and the importance of careful, legal action. He continued documenting every detail, knowing that when the time came, his records would speak for themselves. Photos, measurements, weather logs, expert notes, all became part of a portfolio that could protect him and influence the HOA. It was painstaking work. But he knew that thorough preparation was the most powerful tool he had. At night, he thought about the next steps. He imagined approaching the HOA with his evidence, showing them the risks, and insisting on proper action. He imagined inspectors reviewing the site, confirming the missing permits, and requiring corrections. He imagined the sense of relief he would feel knowing that the land was safe and the rules respected. These thoughts kept him motivated and focused. Despite the stress and the uncertainty, he maintained his daily routines. Walking the dog, tending to the garden, and simple chores helped him stay grounded. Yet, the construction remained in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the challenge he faced. He knew that his next moves would need to be precise and measured. Patience, careful observation, and legal knowledge would win where anger or haste could fail. By the end of Part 2, he had become deeply familiar with every detail of the situation. He knew the HOA's structure, the risks it posed, and the proper steps to address it. He had allies and some neighbors, and expert advice to support his actions. More importantly, he had a clear understanding that lawful, patient, and thoughtful action was more powerful than confrontation. The stage was set for the next phase, turning knowledge into action and protecting his property. Before it was too late, after weeks of observing and documenting the HOA's construction, he realized that knowledge alone would not be enough. It was time to act, but carefully. He could not confront the HOA blindly. Everything had to be based on facts, rules, and careful planning. He spent several evenings drawing diagrams of his own property, showing water flow, soil stability, and how the HOA structure affected the land. These diagrams would help him and any expert he consulted to design a solution that was fully legal and effective. He met again with the land and water expert to discuss possible strategies. The expert suggested that small, legally permitted adjustments could manage water flow and prevent damage. They talked about building a minor dam and diversion channels on his property that would redirect water safely, even if the HOA structure failed or caused flooding. The expert explained step by step what could be done without violating regulations. Each idea was carefully considered, ensuring that his solution would be within the law and would strengthen his position if authorities were called in. The next morning, he began preparations for the project. He purchased the necessary materials, including soil, sandbags, pipes, and small barriers. He kept everything neat, organized, and within the boundaries of his property. Every decision was deliberate, ensuring there was no room for the HOA to claim interference or negligence on his part. He knew that appearances mattered, and demonstrating responsible, lawful behavior could be a powerful tool. Construction of his legal water control system started slowly. He dug small trenches and built diversion channels, carefully following the diagrams. Each measurement was checked multiple times. He worked steadily, taking breaks to review the progress and make adjustments. Even small changes could have big effects on water flow, so he was meticulous. Every step was documented with photos, notes, and measurements. It was hard work, but he felt a sense of purpose and control that he had not felt before. Neighbors began to notice the activity. Some were curious, others skeptical, and a few even asked questions. He explained calmly that he was taking steps to protect his property and prevent flooding. He did not speak badly about the HOA, only focused on safety and legality. Slowly, some neighbors began to understand. They saw that careful planning, preparation, and lawful action were stronger than anger or confrontation. This quiet support gave him confidence to continue. Meanwhile, the HOA construction reached a critical point. The structure now had walls, beams, and a noticeable presence, but small issues were emerging. Water was pooling near its base, soil was shifting under pressure, and the workers seemed unsure how to handle the drainage problems. He observed carefully, noting the changes and photographing each stage. Each flaw was another point he could document for authorities if needed. The HOA appeared confident, but their lack of preparation was becoming increasingly visible. He continued refining his own project. The diversion channels were connected to a small, reinforced area that would safely hold water temporarily before it flowed naturally away. He made sure that all materials used were legal, environmentally safe, and properly secured. His goal was not to retaliate, but to prevent damage and show a practical solution. It was satisfying to see a plan taking shape, one that followed the rules and protected both his property and the surrounding land as he worked. He began researching case studies of similar situations. Homeowners who had faced illegal HOA constructions had successfully used legal water management solutions to protect themselves and force compliance. Reading these stories gave him new ideas and reinforced his belief that patient, methodical action could work. He realized that preparation, evidence, and understanding regulations were far more effective than confrontation. One afternoon, after a week of work on his project, he noticed something unexpected. Heavy rain had started and water began flowing towards the HOA structure. Instinctively, he observed the paths carefully. The water started to collect near the base of the illegal structure as he had anticipated. But because of the diversion channels he had built, his property remained dry. The small dam and channels worked exactly as designed. It was a quiet victory, proof that careful planning and legal action could prevent harm. That evening, he documented everything. Photos showed how the water was managed on his property, contrasted with pooling near the HOA's structure. Notes, detailed measurements, rainfall amounts, and the effects of his channels. He knew this evidence could be invaluable if authorities were involved. The system he had built demonstrated foresight, skill, and lawful action. While highlighting the risks of the HOA's unapproved construction, word of his project began to spread quietly among neighbors. A few approached him, expressing concern for their own properties and admiration for his careful work. They asked questions, took notes, and even offered help with minor tasks. The community's perception was shifting. He realized that leadership did not always mean confrontation. Sometimes it meant demonstrating responsibility and guiding others with knowledge and example. The next days were spent refining and reinforcing the system. He added small barriers to prevent erosion and adjusted water flow to ensure stability. Each step was deliberate. He maintained the property's appearance, avoiding any actions that could provoke the HOA or create the impression of aggression. Every adjustment was documented carefully, and he continued consulting the expert to ensure everything remained legal and effective. Meanwhile, subtle cracks and water issues became more visible on the HOA construction. He observed from a distance as small leaks formed and water began affecting areas beyond their structure. It was becoming clear that without proper planning and permits, the construction could not function as intended. He took detailed photographs and notes, careful to remain neutral and factual. This evidence would be crucial when presenting his case to authorities. He also kept an eye on neighbors who were still unsure about the situation. He answered questions, explained the purpose of his water management system, and shared general advice on property safety. He never criticized the HOA openly, focusing instead on safety, legality, and responsible action. By doing so, he gradually earned trust and respect. People began to see that knowledge, preparation, and calm action could accomplish more than confrontation. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, he inspected the results. Water flowed smoothly through his diversion channels, never reaching his home. Meanwhile, the HOA structure showed signs of stress, pooling water, and uneven soil. The difference was clear. His legal, careful action had protected his property while the illegal construction faced challenges. It was a moment of quiet satisfaction, proof that preparation, patience, and lawful action could overcome recklessness. In the following days, he continued monitoring both his property and the HOA construction. He updated his notes, adjusted barriers slightly where needed, and continued documenting every change. He felt a sense of control and accomplishment. He had turned observation into action, and action into protection. He had demonstrated that careful legal planning could prevent harm and expose risk without conflict. By the end of Part 3, his water management project was fully operational, stable, and well documented. It had withstood initial challenges, and the HOA construction showed visible problems. He had legal evidence, expert guidance, and community awareness. The stage was set for the next phase, involving authorities, forcing accountability and revealing the risks of the HOA's illegal construction. He felt prepared, confident, and ready to take the next steps, knowing that patient, lawful action could lead to real change. After weeks of careful preparation and the successful completion of his water management system, he finally saw an opportunity to take the next step. The HOA construction, although nearly complete, had begun to show the consequences of their lack of planning. Water pooled in unexpected areas, soil had shifted, and cracks were visible along the base. It was no longer just a concern, it was becoming a problem that could not be ignored. He knew it was time to involve the authorities, but he approached it calmly. With thorough documentation in hand, he visited the local building department again. This time, armed with photos, notes, and expert recommendations. The clerk listened intently as he explained the situation. He presented his documentation in an organized manner, highlighting the lack of permits, the structural risks, and the potential impact on neighboring properties. The clerk nodded, taking copies of the material and assuring him that an inspection could be scheduled. He felt a quiet sense of relief. His preparation had made it easy for the authorities to understand the situation clearly. A few days later, inspectors arrived at the neighborhood. He watched from a distance, taking care not to interfere but noting their every action. The inspectors walked around the HOA construction, measured areas, examined the foundation, and took photographs. They asked questions about permits and approvals, and he provided factual information about the absence of any records. He remained calm, factual, and polite, avoiding any emotional commentary. The inspectors seemed thorough, and he felt confident that his evidence would support their assessment. Meanwhile, the HOA board members began noticing the inspectors' presence. Their initial confidence faded as they saw authorities carefully examining the construction. Some tried to explain or defend their project, but without permits, there was little they could say. The board members looked unsettled, glancing at each other nervously. He observed quietly, noting the shift in their demeanor. They were no longer in control. The situation was unfolding as he had anticipated. The inspectors spent several hours reviewing the site. They tested water flow, checked soil stability, and measured distances carefully. His own diversion system was working exactly as planned, diverting water safely and preventing any issues on his property. It was a subtle but clear demonstration of proper planning and legal action. He knew the inspectors were taking note of both the risks of the HOA construction and the effectiveness of lawful solutions. After the inspection, he spoke briefly with one of the inspectors. They confirmed that the construction was being reviewed for violations, and that the HOA could face orders to modify or remove the structure if permits were missing or if risks were identified. The inspector also suggested that neighbors who had documented observations might be contacted for verification. He thanked the inspector and continued to maintain his documentation meticulously. Knowing it could now play a decisive role, word began to spread through the neighborhood that the authorities were inspecting the HOA project. Some neighbors expressed surprise, others relief. A few approached him, sharing their own concerns and asking about the process. He explained calmly that patience, proper evidence, and legal steps were crucial. His quiet and factual approach inspired confidence, and some neighbors even volunteered additional photos or observations to support the case. Slowly, the community began to recognize the value of careful, lawful action. Meanwhile, the HOA board attempted to continue the construction, but the inspector's presence and the documented issues caused delays. They realized that the project could not proceed without proper approvals. Tension grew among the board members and internal disagreements became visible. Some wanted to halt the project. Others hoped to push forward regardless. He observed this quietly, understanding that their indecision was a result of their own earlier disregard for the rules. One afternoon, heavy rain arrived. The HOA construction struggled under the weather, showing leaks, water accumulation, and soil erosion. Meanwhile, his diversion channels continued to function perfectly, redirecting water safely and preventing any damage to his property. He photographed the effects, noting the contrast between lawful preparation and reckless construction. The images and notes were now even stronger evidence for the authorities and further proof that careful planning and legal action could prevent harm. He also kept engaging quietly with neighbors. Some expressed renewed interest in protecting their own properties, asking for advice on drainage and safety. He shared practical tips without criticizing the HOA, focusing on knowledge, awareness, and lawful actions. By doing so, he reinforced the idea that responsible planning and preparation were more effective than anger or confrontation. Community trust continued to grow, and he felt a quiet sense of leadership emerging as the inspections progressed. HOA board received formal notices from the authorities. They were required to halt construction until proper permits were obtained and safety concerns addressed. Some board members were frustrated, others anxious. But the reality was clear. Their unapproved project could not proceed without compliance. He observed the situation carefully, understanding that the legal process was working as intended. Preparation, documentation, and calm action had shifted the balance of power. Throughout this time, he continued to maintain his property. The diversion system required occasional adjustments, but it was stable and effective. He also continued documenting changes, rainfall, and the condition of the HOA structure. Each note and photograph reinforced the overall evidence. He knew that thorough records would protect him and strengthen the case if further inspections or legal actions were required. One evening, he walked past the HOA construction with a few neighbors who had expressed concern. They observed the pooling water, shifting soil, and uneven foundation together. He explained in simple terms how small mistakes and lack of permits could lead to larger problems. His calm, factual explanation helped neighbors understand the risks clearly. They were impressed by his methodical approach and the effectiveness of his diversion system. Slowly, more neighbors began to respect the value of preparation and legal compliance. The HOA board, facing mounting pressure from authorities, community awareness, and visible structural issues, finally began to acknowledge the problems. They started consulting experts and considering modifications to address safety and permit concerns. The change was noticeable. What had begun as arrogance and secrecy was now replaced by cautious compliance. He observed quietly, noting the contrast between responsible action and reckless behavior. Meanwhile, he continued communicating with the building department, ensuring that all updates, evidence, and observations were submitted properly. He stayed factual and calm, reinforcing the reliability of his documentation. This careful approach ensured that authorities could take decisive action without any ambiguity. It also strengthened the credibility of his position compared to the HOA board, who had initially ignored rules and risks. Over the following weeks, authorities monitored the situation closely. The HOA construction was temporarily halted, inspections were repeated, and additional documentation was requested. He continued to maintain his diversion system, refine minor adjustments, document every change in weather, soil, and water flow. Each day he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his careful, legal actions were protecting his property and setting an example for neighbors. By the end of Part 4, the HOA was visibly unsettled. Facing inspections, community scrutiny, and legal requirements. His diversion system had performed flawlessly, protecting his property and demonstrating the importance of careful planning and lawful action. Neighbors were more aware, some actively observing, and the authorities were fully engaged in ensuring compliance. He had successfully moved from observation and preparation to action and accountability, setting the stage for the final part where consequences and resolution would unfold. His patience, careful planning, and calm approach had turned a risky situation into one where safety, law, and reason prevailed. After weeks of inspections, documentation, and careful monitoring, the final phase of the situation began to unfold. The authorities had reviewed all the evidence, including his detailed notes, photographs, and expert recommendations. They were now prepared to take action against the HOA for constructing without permits and ignoring safety rules. He watched from a distance, calm but focused, knowing that his preparation and patience had brought him to this moment. The HOA board was called to meet with the inspectors and officials. Some board members were nervous, others defensive. The officials carefully explained the violations, the risks, and the necessary actions that the HOA needed to take. They emphasized that the structure could not remain as it was and required proper permits, modifications, or even removal if compliance could not be achieved. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the consequences of their previous actions. The power they had assumed was now being balanced by law and accountability. He continued monitoring the situation, ensuring that the HOA followed instructions and that any further developments were carefully documented. He remained neutral in his approach, focusing solely on facts and safety. He knew that patience and consistency were key, and any misstep could weaken the position he had built so meticulously over the past weeks. Meanwhile, his diversion system continued to function flawlessly. Each day, water flowed smoothly through the channels, preventing flooding or erosion on his property. The small dam held back water as needed, and minor adjustments maintained stability. His careful planning had not only protected his land, but also highlighted the contrast between lawful preparation and the OA's earlier reckless construction. Neighbors began to see the results clearly. Some expressed quiet admiration for his methodical approach. The HOA board began making adjustments under official supervision. Engineers and inspectors were brought in to assess structural stability, drainage, and safety concerns. The construction was halted until proper plans could be submitted and approved. The board members faced fines and were required to correct the errors in their project. He observed quietly, documenting each step. The transformation from arrogance and oversight to compliance and caution was apparent. The authorities' intervention had shifted the situation decisively. Neighbors, previously hesitant or fearful, now approached him for advice. They asked about how to monitor construction, manage water flow, and ensure property safety. He shared his experiences, demonstrating that careful observation, documentation, and legal compliance were more effective than confrontation or complaint alone. Slowly, a sense of community awareness began to grow. People understood that rules existed to protect everyone, and that responsible action could prevent unnecessary damage or conflict. As the weeks passed, the HOA construction underwent significant modifications. Engineers reinforced the foundation, corrected drainage, and submitted proper permit applications. The inspectors conducted regular checks to ensure compliance. The board members, once confident in their unchecked actions, now followed guidance and regulations carefully. He observed each change, noting improvements, as well as ongoing vigilance by the authorities. His patience and thorough planning had created an environment where accountability could not be ignored. Throughout this process, he continued to maintain his own property. Minor adjustments to the diversion channels ensured continued protection. He recorded each change, rainfall event, and observation of the HOA structure. This meticulous approach reinforced the credibility of his evidence and demonstrated a consistent commitment to lawful and responsible action. He remained calm, knowing that his consistent behavior would speak louder than words. One afternoon, after a period of heavy rain, he walked along his property line, The diversion system worked perfectly, protecting his home and yard from flooding. Meanwhile, the HOA construction struggled in some areas. Highlighting the importance of following proper engineering and safety practices, he took photographs and updated his notes, documenting the clear contrast between careful, lawful preparation and reckless, unapproved construction. It was a silent but powerful affirmation of his approach. The community slowly adjusted to the new reality. Neighbors discussed the importance of permits, safety, and accountability. Some thanked him quietly for demonstrating the value of observation, preparation, and lawful action. Others shared their own concerns about property safety and the need to be proactive. Through calm, factual, and responsible behavior, he had influenced the community to be more aware and careful.